There was a single week in July 1863 when the Confederacy lost the war, and almost nobody in either army realized it had happened. No treaty was signed. No army surrendered. The killing continued for 2 more brutal years. But if you know where to look, you can trace the exact moment the outcome tipped, and it is not the moment most people assume. That is the strange, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath almost everything taught about the American Civil War. It was not decided in one battle, or one year, or one dramatic reversal. It was decided across a series of specific hinge points, each one small enough to have gone the other way, each one large enough on its own to have changed everything that followed it for the rest of the war. Miss any one of them, and the story stops making sense. This is every turning point of the Civil War, explained in 25 minutes: the decisions, the accidents, and the single afternoons that determined whether the United States would survive as one country or split permanently into two. Start with the turning point almost nobody counts as one, because it happened before the first shot was fired. In February 1861, delegates from the seceding Southern states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and elected Jefferson Davis president of the new Confederate States of America. Davis was on paper an obvious choice, a West Point graduate, a former Secretary of War, a man with more formal military credentials than almost anyone in either government. What the delegates in Montgomery could not have known was that formal credentials in wartime political leadership are almost entirely different skills, and the man they had just chosen would spend the next 4 years struggling with the second one in ways that would matter as much as any battlefield defeat. 1,000 miles north, a prairie lawyer with a single unremarkable term in Congress was settling into the White House with no military experience at all. The gap between these two men's ability to hold a fractured coalition together would turn out to be one of the quiet forces deciding the entire war, and it started mattering long before either side had fired a shot in anger. The shots came on April 12, 1861, when Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And the turning point here is not the battle itself — nobody died in the bombardment — but what the bombardment triggered. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion forced every border state still undecided to choose a side immediately, and 4 of them chose the Confederacy. Virginia's secession alone changed the entire geography of the war, handing the South its most experienced officer corps, its most productive industrial base outside of a handful of Deep South cities, and a capital in Richmond close enough to Washington that the Eastern Theater would be fought for 4 years across barely 100 miles of contested Virginia countryside. Had Virginia stayed neutral or joined the Union, there is no guarantee the war looks anything like the one that actually happened. Robert E. Lee, offered command of Union forces days before Virginia seceded, resigned his U.S. Army commission specifically because his home state chose the Confederacy. That single personal decision, made because of a state government vote in Richmond, gave the South the general who would keep the war alive for years longer than its material resources should have allowed. It is worth pausing on how close that decision actually was. Lee agonized over it for days, writing to his sister that he could take no part in an invasion of the Southern states, but also could not raise his hand against his birthplace, his home, his children. He resigned his commission on April 20th, 1861, just 3 days after Virginia's secession convention voted to leave the Union, and within weeks he was commanding Virginia's state forces. Had that convention vote gone differently, and it was not a foregone conclusion, since Virginia's delegates had initially voted against secession in April, before Lincoln's call for troops changed the political calculation overnight. The entire command structure of the Confederate Army, and quite possibly the war's entire trajectory, would have unfolded along a completely different path. First Bull Run, fought that July outside Washington, mattered less for who won than for what it destroyed on both sides. The assumption that this would be a short war. Union troops marched out from Washington in high spirits, some accompanied by civilian spectators who had packed picnics to watch what they expected to be a quick, decisive Union victory. Confederate forces routed them instead, sending Union soldiers and panicked civilians alike fleeing back toward Washington in a chaotic retreat that humiliated the North and convinced the South, dangerously, that Southern soldiers were simply better fighters than Northern ones. Both conclusions were wrong, and both would cost their respective sides dearly. The Union used the defeat to begin building the kind of large, professionally trained army that a real war would require. The Confederacy, flush with a victory that flattered its own self-image, spent the following year underestimating an opponent that was quietly assembling the industrial and manpower advantages that would eventually determine the outcome. That underestimation, more than any single tactical error, would prove costly across the following 3 years of a war that neither side, in July 1861, believed would last anywhere near that long. The next turning point is the one people remember for the wrong reason. Antietam, fought on the September 17, 1862, remains the bloodiest single day in American military history, with more than 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing by nightfall. But its real significance had almost nothing to do with the tactical outcome, which was closer to a draw than a decisive victory for either side. What Antietam actually did was give Abraham Lincoln the political cover he had been waiting for. Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation months earlier, but held it back on the advice of his cabinet until the Union could point to something resembling a battlefield success. Issuing it after a defeat would have looked like desperation rather than strength. Antietam, messy and inconclusive as it was, forced Lee's army to withdraw from Maryland, and that withdrawal was enough. 5 days later, Lincoln announced that slaves in Confederate territory would be declared free as of January 1st in 1863. The war's purpose changed in that instant, from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight that would also end slavery. And that change closed off the Confederacy's last realistic hope of European intervention. Britain and France, both of which had been edging toward recognizing Confederate independence, could not politically survive supporting a nation now explicitly fighting to preserve human bondage. The diplomatic door the Confederacy had been counting on since 1861 closed within days of Lincoln's announcement, and it never reopened. Then came the week in July 1863 that decided more than either side understood at the time. On July 3rd at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee ordered roughly 12,000 men across nearly a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland directly into the center of the Union line, in an assault that history remembers as Pickett's Charge. It failed catastrophically, and it ended Lee's second and final attempt to carry the war onto Northern soil, where a Confederate victory might have shattered Northern political will to continue fighting. 1 day earlier, and 800 miles away, Ulysses Grant's siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, was entering its final hours. Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th, the day after Gettysburg ended, and its fall gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy cleanly in half and severing Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the eastern half of the Confederate nation they were supposed to be supplying. Two Confederate disasters on consecutive days, 800 miles apart, neither one directly connected to the other except by the calendar. Historians still argue about whether either alone would have been enough to seal the Confederacy's fate. Together, occurring within 24 hours of each other, they left no realistic path back for the South, even though the fighting would grind on for nearly 2 more years before anyone admitted it. Confederate President Jefferson Davis received the news from Vicksburg and Gettysburg within days of each other, and his private correspondence from that period shows a man beginning to grasp, even as he continued issuing confident public statements, how badly the strategic picture had shifted. The Mississippi River had been, from the earliest days of the war, one of the Confederacy's most important internal arteries, and its loss meant that Confederate forces east of the river could no longer draw on the cattle, horses, and grain that Texas and Arkansas had been supplying since 1861. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, Lee's army limped back across the Potomac, having suffered roughly 28,000 casualties, a loss so severe that the Army of Northern Virginia would never again possess the manpower to mount a serious invasion of Northern territory. The Confederacy would remain dangerous on defense for nearly 2 more years. Its capacity to win the war through offensive victory ended that first week of July 1863. Before any of that could happen, though, Lincoln had to solve a problem that had cost the Union 3 years and several failed commanders. Finding a general willing to fight the war, Grant's own record in the West had already proven could be won. In March 1864, Lincoln brought Grant east and gave him command of all Union armies, a decision that changed the character of the war almost immediately. Every previous commander of the Army of the Potomac had, after a bloody setback, retreated to regroup, giving Lee's army time to recover. Grant did not retreat. After the brutal two-day fight in the wilderness that May, when the Army realized from the direction of its own march that it was moving toward Richmond rather than away from it, soldiers who had fought in Virginia for 3 years without a general who kept pressing forward reportedly cheered in the dark. That single strategic shift, continuous pressure, instead of recovery and retreat, turned the war in Virginia into precisely the grinding war of attrition the Confederacy could least afford to fight, even though it would cost the Union staggering casualties to execute. Grant understood something his predecessors never fully accepted. The Union could replace its losses and the Confederacy could not, which meant a war of pure attrition, however brutal, favored the North in the arithmetic that mattered most. There is a turning point that rarely makes anyone's list, and it deserves to, because without it, Sherman never reaches Atlanta at all. In September 1863, Confederate forces under Braxton Bragg defeated the Union Army of the Cumberland at Chickamauga, driving it back into Chattanooga in a rout so complete that Confederate cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest reported the Union Army was broken and could be destroyed entirely with immediate pursuit. Bragg hesitated. He allowed the defeated Union force to reorganize inside Chattanooga, resupply, and eventually break the siege that followed, and Ulysses Grant arrived that winter to finish what Bragg's hesitation had left undone. Union control of Chattanooga, secured by the following spring, opened the direct rail and road corridor into Georgia that Sherman would use for his entire Atlanta campaign a year later. A single Confederate commander's failure to press an advantage his own cavalry had already identified for him quietly determined the invasion route that would eventually decide a presidential election. Forrest was reportedly so furious at Bragg's refusal to finish the job that he confronted him directly afterward and told him he would never serve under his command again. The next turning point unfolded far from any battlefield, in the arithmetic of an election that almost nobody outside the United States paid close attention to at the time. By the summer of 1864, the war had run for 3 years, and the human cost had grown so severe that Lincoln privately believed he would lose his bid for re-election that November. Grant's campaign through Virginia had produced casualty numbers that shocked even a Northern public that had grown accustomed to bad news, and the Democratic Party's peace platform, calling for a negotiated end to the war, was gaining real traction. If Lincoln had lost that election, his successor would very likely have pursued exactly the kind of settlement that would have allowed the Confederacy to survive as an independent nation. The Confederate strategy for the entire second half of the war rested on this single calculation, not on defeating Union armies outright, but on making the war expensive and prolonged enough that the Northern electorate would choose to stop paying for it. What broke that calculation was the fall of Atlanta. William Tecumseh Sherman's army took the city on September 2nd, 1864, after a months-long campaign that had tested Northern patience nearly as much as it tested Confederate defenses. The timing could not have mattered more. News of Atlanta's capture reached Northern newspapers just as the presidential campaign was entering its final stretch, and it transformed the political mood almost overnight. Lincoln won re-election that November with 55% of the popular vote, a result that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. The Northern electorate had been given a reason to believe victory was achievable, and it chose to keep fighting for it. The Confederate strategy of outlasting Northern political will had depended entirely on that will cracking before Southern resources gave out. After November 1864, there was no version of the war left in which that strategy could still work. Lincoln himself understood exactly how close the margin had been. In August, 6 weeks before Atlanta fell, he had written a private memorandum acknowledging that his re-election appeared unlikely and pledging to cooperate with his successor's transition, even though it would almost certainly mean a negotiated peace in Confederate independence. He sealed the memo, had his cabinet members sign the outside without reading its contents, and put it away. That document, discovered and made public only after the war, stands as one of the starkest pieces of evidence for how genuinely contingent the war's outcome remained until the final months of 1864. A single Confederate city holding out 6 more weeks might have changed the entire trajectory of American history. Sherman's March to the Sea, which began in November 1864, once Atlanta had fallen and the election was decided, represented a different kind of turning point, not a single battle but a change in what war itself meant. Sherman marched 60,000 men from Atlanta to Savannah with orders to destroy the Confederacy's capacity to keep fighting rather than simply defeat its armies in the field. Railroads were torn up and heated until the rails bent around trees, unusable ever again. Warehouses, mills, and plantations that supplied Confederate armies were burned systematically along a 60-mile-wide corridor. This was total war in a sense the conflict had not seen before, aimed as much at the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself as at its soldiers, and it worked with brutal efficiency. Sherman then turned north into the Carolinas in early 1865, and the psychological effect on Confederate soldiers serving in Virginia, many of whom were receiving letters from families in Sherman's path describing homes burned and food destroyed, accelerated a wave of desertion that Robert E. Lee's own correspondence to Jefferson Davis described with open alarm. An army cannot fight effectively when its soldiers are choosing, in growing numbers, between duty to a collapsing cause and the survival of families they had just learned were in immediate danger. By the winter of 1865, Lee's own strength returns to Richmond showed an army losing men to desertion faster than it could realistically replace them. The final turning point arrived not as a single dramatic reversal, but as a slow, grinding collapse that had been building for months. Grant's siege of Petersburg, which had locked the two main armies in place through the winter of 1864 into 1865, finally broke in early April when Union forces overwhelmed the thin Confederate lines protecting the last railroad supply routes into Richmond. Lee abandoned both Richmond and Petersburg on April 2nd, hoping to link his exhausted army with Confederate forces still in North Carolina. But Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan cut off every escape route before that link could happen. On April 9, 1865, at a small courthouse in the village of Appomattox, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant. In the terms Grant offered parole rather than imprisonment, officers permitted to keep their sidearms, soldiers permitted to keep horses needed for spring planting, reflected a deliberate choice to make reunification easier than punishment would have allowed. Other Confederate forces would surrender in the weeks that followed, but Appomattox marked the moment when the war's outcome, contested and uncertain for 4 brutal years, finally became a fact nobody could argue with any longer. The two generals met inside the McLean house, a private home requisitioned for the occasion, and witnesses on both sides described the meeting as quiet, almost formal, without any of the theatrical humiliation that a defeated army might reasonably have feared. Lee arrived in a full dress uniform, prepared, he later said, to accept whatever terms were given. Grant arrived in a mud-spattered field coat, apologizing for his appearance, and spent several minutes making small talk about their shared service in the Mexican War before turning to the business at hand. That tone, restrained, almost gentle, entirely without vindictiveness, set the pattern for how the surrender was handled, and it stood in sharp contrast to how victorious armies had historically treated defeated ones throughout most of military history. Whether that restraint served the country well in the long run is a question historians are still arguing about today, particularly given how quickly Reconstruction's early promises would unravel in the decades that followed. But in the moment itself, at that small courthouse in central Virginia, the war that had defined an entire generation of American life ended not with vengeance, but with two tired men discussing horses their soldiers would need for spring planting. Laid end to end like this, these turning points reveal something the standard telling of the Civil War tends to obscure: how little of the outcome was ever truly settled at any single moment, and how much of it depended on choices that could plausibly have gone another way. A different vote in Richmond keeps Virginia in the Union, and Lee in a Union uniform. A lost dispatch at Antietam delays the Emancipation Proclamation and keeps the door to European recognition open a little longer. A different outcome at Chattanooga, or a Confederate army that pursues its advantage after Chickamauga instead of pausing, and Sherman never reaches Atlanta in time to save Lincoln's reelection. War is usually remembered afterward as though its ending were inevitable from the start. The Civil War, examined turning point by turning point, was not inevitable at all. It was decided in increments across 4 years by men making decisions under pressure with information that was almost always incomplete, and the country that emerged on the other side of Appomattox was shaped, in ways still visible today, by every one of those decisions going the way they did instead of any of the ways they easily might have gone. That is, in the end, what separates a genuine understanding of the Civil War from the version most people carry around without ever examining it closely. The war did not move in a straight line from Fort Sumter to Appomattox, inevitable at every step. It moved through a series of narrow doorways, any one of which could have swung shut. Virginia could have stayed neutral. The Emancipation Proclamation could have been delayed past the point of usefulness. Bragg could have pursued his advantage at Chickamauga. Atlanta could have held 6 weeks longer. Any single one of those doorways closing differently produces a different country entirely, possibly two countries, permanently divided on a continent that instead spent the following century and a half as one. Understanding the war this way, turning point by turning point rather than as a single inevitable march toward a known ending, is what makes the history worth returning to. It was never as settled as it looks now, looking backward from 160 years later.